Okay, well, welcome. We are at class number 7 after a nice little winter break, ushering in the new year 2023 with some Jewish history. So as always, I want to give a little bit of a review just so we're all caught up here. And then today is the second out of 3 days that we're going to spend talking about the Talmud. And so we can kind of review what we discussed about a month ago in our last session, and then we'll carry on with the wider period of the Talmud today. And then also next Monday, we will conclude our rabbinic Judaism. But this is a time period that takes place over roughly 700 to 800 years. So it's definitely worth spending a couple of weeks. So where we are in history, we have passed the year 0. We passed that last week. And so just to share my screen and do a very quick review of what we did the past 2 weeks, because that leads us nicely into where we're at today. So we spent a good amount of time talking about the exile and subsequent Second Temple Judaism. And so those are things that we covered in previous classes, but just to give a 20-second review for people who are coming back at this after a month of not really thinking about Jewish history, one of the most radical shifts that happened already hundreds of years before where we're going to start today, but was the Babylonian exile. And that is after hundreds of years of Israelites and Jews living in the wider land of Israel or the province of Judea, however we want to think about it. That was when the Babylonian Empire came in the 6th century BCE, and they exiled at that point the area of Judah, and so the Jews, to Babylonia. And that's really where a lot of scholars suggest that Judaism starts, as opposed to being just the tribal religion of the Israelites, because oftentimes, and this is something we discussed a couple weeks ago, but it's worth repeating, oftentimes identity is forged as a reaction to external stimuli. So what that means in, I guess, less scholarly words is if everything is slowly evolving, and at the outset of Jewish history, we discussed this in the first 2 classes, right? Early Israelite history was hundreds of years of slow evolution of adopting specific rituals and ideas and texts. It's a lot less important to ask the question, who are we? What are we? What do we believe? What do we think? What do we do? Because there's a certain naturalness to everything. All of a sudden, once the Jews are kicked out into exile, right? This is a similar phenomenon, let's say, when people go off to college, right? For the first time, when you're not in your home environment, right? For people that have had 0 through 18 living at home and then go to college for the first time, there's often that question of, okay, now I'm meeting a lot of people that I'm not used to. And now for the first time in my life, I actually have to define who I am as a reaction to this other culture. And so Judaism went through this also in the 6th century BCE. And so by the time they got around to returning into the land of Israel, once the Persian Empire and King Cyrus took over, there were already a whole bunch of noticeable differences to Judaism, which led to this first bullet point I'm saying in the timeline of the rabbis, to what I'll call Second Temple decentralization. And so we spoke about this a lot, I think, in class 3 or 4, but by the time the Israelites and the Jews went back to Israel, there was already a bunch of decentralization, right? Even though the temple was rebuilt, Jerusalem was no longer the singular central point of Jewish life. There were plenty of Jews that didn't want to go back to Israel, that wanted to stay in Babylonia. And we'll talk about that a lot over the course of probably next week when we focus more on Jewish life in Babylonia from the 3rd to 8th century CE. But even the Jews who made it back west towards Israel, a lot of them didn't want to have much to do with Jerusalem. A lot of them saw the temple as increasingly irrelevant and corrupt. A lot of Jews we know, especially after the Greeks took over, ended up moving to places like Alexandria and slowly into other places like Greece. And so the story of the Second Temple is a story of slow decentralization. And this is also at the same time, this is what we discussed last week, this is the start of what we might call the oral Torah, right? Because again, once Judaism goes into exile, you have to figure out a way to adapt your legal structure, right? Very similar to how the Constitution won't get you very far to understanding modern day American law. The Constitution might be a starting point, but if you actually want to understand American law on, I'll just pick the Second Amendment, you can't just read the Second Amendment and have a clue of what's going on, right? You have to read the last multi-hundred-year tradition of Supreme Court decisions and all of the various legal arguments that have been made there. And so Judaism went through this exact same process. And so you have this period now in the Second Temple period where you have people who were in charge of the upkeep of this oral tradition. And this is what we started with last week. These people are called by Josephus the Pharisees, and they were people that were increasingly digging into the richness of this oral tradition and increasingly moving away from I'll call it overly literal view of the Torah. And so this is, again, all review from last week, right? The Pharisees were not without their detractors, right? There was the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots, right? So there was definitely a lot of people to disagree with this new movement that was focused more and more on the oral Torah. But hindsight 2020, right? We know that the oral Torah sort of won out. And now one of the things that we closed with last time is whether we're talking about ultra-Orthodoxy or Reform or people that identify as Jewish but completely secular, right? Everybody is to some extent a rabbinic Jew in the modern world, because our view of Judaism has been so shaped by the rabbinic period that showing somebody just the words of the Torah and expecting them to understand anything about Judaism is almost comedic. And the example we gave last time is we all know Pesach or Passover to the central ritual to be a Seder, right? The Seder is noticeably absent from the text of the Torah. The Torah talks about a ritual where you take a lamb, right, on the 14th of the month of Nisan, and you have all these communities come, and the whole thing revolves around a sacrifice. And so, right, the rabbinic tradition and the Talmud, which we'll dig into more today, is really that bridge between how do we get from this biblical law that's meant to be centered around a centralized temple and Israel and Jerusalem and have priests and things like that, all the way to a tradition that we can all practice today in 2023 in Fullerton. And we see a direct connection back to the Torah, albeit we all know what we're doing is not verbatim reading the Torah and then trying to mirror that in our practice. And so the last thing we ended with last time, which we kind of rushed through, so I wanted to re-go over that today, was the first central tension of rabbinic Judaism. Today, we're going to focus on some other tensions, but the first central tension of rabbinic Judaism is this constant dialectic between tradition and innovation. And we did two sources at the end last time, and I just want to read them real quick again, because the most interesting thing, I think, for Talmud study is seeing this tension at play. And what I mean by this tension, before I go to these sources, and then this will be the end of the review and we'll get into some new material, is the rabbis are making two claims or trying to do two things at the same time that are a paradox. They're the opposite of each other. The rabbis are trying to make sure that Jewish tradition is not lost. And so their first mission was, after the temple was destroyed in the year 70 CE, and even a little bit before that, the rabbis saw the writing on the wall. They knew that Jews were spreading out, right? No longer was Jerusalem going to be the center of the Jewish world. The center of the Jewish world, I mean, it's an interesting question. If somebody were to ask today, what is the center of the Jewish world? You could imagine a bunch of different answers, right? Somebody could plausibly tell you that Israel or Jerusalem is the center of the Jewish world, but maybe it's actually Tel Aviv, because that's where a lot of the innovation is coming from in Israel. Maybe it's actually New York City, because that's still the city that has so much Jewish culture from it, right? Maybe there's an argument to make for Los Angeles, right? You start to see where this is going, right? We don't have a center of the Jewish world today. We have many population centers, and they all have their distinct culture. But to imagine that there's one city that everybody in the Jewish world agrees, oh yes, of course, this is the one city that's in charge of all religious and cultural development, right? That was obviously not going to be the case for the last 2,000 years. And so one such reason for the cultivation of the Talmud was the rabbis wanting to create a bulwark against this phenomenon. And they were afraid, right, a very legitimate fear, where they said, well, if everybody's going to spread out everywhere, right, if we're going to have Jews living in Fullerton and New York and Irvine and Chicago, and maybe some even moving overseas, we need a centralized tradition to make sure that it's not anything goes, right? We want some way that if a Jew from, let's say, Washington, D.C. travels to Orange County for Shabbat, they know that they're at a synagogue of the same religious tradition, and the laws aren't that different and the ideas aren't that different. So that was one such justification of the Talmud. The other completely opposite justification for the Talmud, which we'll get into a little bit more later today, is the rabbis correctly understood that the biblical legal tradition in the Torah was centered around a place in a specific time with specific rituals, in a certain geographical area, right? And we sort of all intuitively know this, right? Every year during the annual Torah cycle, when we get around to the books of Leviticus and Numbers, not everybody, most people check out a little bit, because when we're reading through the book of Leviticus and we're reading about laws of sacrifices and laws of building the tabernacle and laws of ritual purity and laws of the agricultural laws that only are relevant to Israel, there is a little bit of a shoulder shrug and say, well, that might have been interesting and relevant thousands of years ago, but how is that directly relevant now? And so the Talmud's second purpose was to answer that question. And for the rabbis to basically say, a lot of these rituals that are biblical rituals need to be played around with and adapted and molded into something that is going to be relevant for the next 2,000 years. And the rabbis, again, were masters at this, right? Just our example of the Passover Seder is one such great example of this, of saying, okay, well, we're not all going to take our lamb in April this year and sacrifice it and rub blood on the doorpost and everything like that. We're all going to cook a nice meal, invite family and friends over, and talk about the story. And so the rabbis did this for virtually everything in Judaism. And again, there comes in the tension, because you're trying to simultaneously save and preserve tradition while also radically changing the parts of tradition that you view to be either historically untenable or, as we'll talk about later today, ethically and morally problematic, which is where I want to focus on today. But just to go over these two sources real quick, and then our review will be totally finished. We learn in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, right, one of the tractates of Mishnah, that Moses received the Torah at Sinai. He transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders, elders to the prophets, and prophets to the men of the great assembly. And so this is, I would say, the black and white view of everything that ends up in the Talmud is a 100% preservation of tradition view, right? This is saying the rabbis are not doing anything new, right? They're just taking what they received from their parents and teachers who took from what they received, and you can draw a straight line straight to Moses, right? Everything's the exact same, right? Don't worry too much. We're preserving tradition. And we juxtapose that. There was plenty of text to juxtapose this with, but one of my favorite is this long analogy, and I won't read it verbatim, but the rabbis give an analogy as to what the oral Torah is. For people who want to skim it as I'm talking, feel free. And the rabbis paint this analogy of a king who has two different servants, and one servant to both servants, he gives a bunch of wheat and flax. And one servant is a very loyal servant. And so he takes that wheat and flax and locks it up in a safe and makes sure no one touches it. And every day maybe he goes and takes care of it, but doesn't do anything with it. The second servant, who takes the wheat and the flax and takes the raw material and bakes bread and weaves tablecloths and does all these things with it. And then the king shows up months later, and the king looks at the servant who did nothing with the raw materials and basically says, these are my words, not the rabbis, you're an idiot, right? I didn't give you the raw materials to sit there in a safe. If somebody hands you wheat and flax, obviously the purpose there is to use your creative and experience to mold something of that. So too, the rabbis analogize this to the Torah. The Torah is not a loaf of bread that's ready to consume. The Torah is much more like a bundle of wheat. So it's much more up to the community and to the leaders of the community and the rabbis and whoever else to actually dictate what we're going to weave these raw materials to. And so this is, again, the tension that the rabbis were dealing with when writing the Mishnah and Gemara, and we'll talk more about the hard history here about what is Mishnah, what is Gemara, what's the difference. But in writing down and in creating the Talmud, this again was the juggling act that the rabbis tried to keep. And I'll say one more thing that I don't think I got to say last week. This is the juggling act of Judaism for the last 2,000 years. This is the tension that virtually every Jewish community, and it doesn't matter where on the denominational or ideological spectrum, everybody's juggling this at some point. Because I think we all intuitively know that given that the world is changing, if Judaism stays stagnant, it quickly becomes irrelevant. But we also probably know that if Judaism doesn't retain any of the traditional sameness that it had during our parents' generation and their parents' generation, that thing no longer deserves to be called Judaism. And so where you draw that line, obviously, the Jewish community will never agree where to draw that line. And I would argue the difference between denominations or even different ideological strains is just different points on that spectrum. But everybody that is sort of engaged in the modern Jewish community is engaging with this question, whether on an explicit or implicit level. Okay, so that was all mostly review. I think I added in a couple more things. And Michael, I'll get to your question at the end. It's an interesting question. And I do want to, sorry, I'm just reading the chat. Michael asked if we can view Jesus and his followers as a Reformation movement of Judaism. I'll get to that in 1 second, because I actually think that'll fit in well with where we're moving on to right now. So thank you for the question. And sorry, I always see the chat questions very delayed. Okay, so just going back to this timeline, because I want everybody here to have a good sense of this timeline. And Ethan, I'll get to your question in 1 second also, just so we all have an idea of, because I feel like often in the Jewish community, people throw out these terms, the rabbis, the Talmud, the Mishnah. And so I want us definitely to leave today's class with everybody has a clear picture in their head, at least what somebody is talking about when they say the Talmud or the Gemara or the Mishnah or the rabbis, and they're not just this vague group of people who we have this intuitive sense were important. So the first stage of rabbinic development were the Pharisees. And this is already a little bit controversial about exactly who the Pharisees were, right? Josephus clearly talks about the Pharisees as precursor to the rabbis. It is actually a little bit of an academic debate. There are academics, it's a minority view, but there are academics that would argue the Pharisees and rabbis have to be viewed as sort of different streams of thought. And then I put in parentheses here the Anshe Knesset HaGadola, because oftentimes the rabbis in the Talmud talk about the Pharisees or talk about this second temple group that was focused on the oral Torah, and the term they use is Anshe Knesset HaGadola. So in case anybody's ever seen those terms, and that roughly translates to men of the great assembly, right? In the rabbi's view, and this might be historical fiction or based on a true story, right? Not actually historically happened. The rabbis hundreds of years later imagine at the early time of oral Torah history, groups of men gathering and actually developing a lot of these oral traditions. Whether or not it actually happened like that, again, scholars could continue to debate, but oftentimes the rabbis will speak about the Anshe Knesset HaGadola, men of great assembly, and what they're talking about here is this first stage of development of the oral Torah. The next stage we get is what's called the Zugot, and those are the pairs. And so those are, again, before anything was written down, before anybody was conscious that they were engaging in an act of this preservation of tradition, there were these great study rivals, the most famous of whom are Hillel and Shammai, who most of us have probably heard about, but there were 4 other pairs of Zugot. And these were leaders in the community that had ideological disputes. And a lot of those disputes have sort of made it down to the Mishnah later on in probably certainly oral tradition, because again, this is still operating under the rubric of the oral Torah. And so these were oral debates that were later written down to be part of the backbone of the Mishnah. And so this then continues, right? You have all of these study pairs and they're debating and discussing the ins and outs of oral tradition. And what I mean by that is they take a verse in the Torah, and let's take our example of, Sukkot, you're supposed to wave a lulav and etrog, right? I'm just going to come up with this question out of thin air, but this is actually a debate in the Talmud, right? What does it actually mean to wave something, right? The Torah tells us you should wave a lulav and etrog. One can imagine if I opened it up to all 20 of us here and I said, give me a succinct definition of what it means to wave a lulav and etrog, we will probably get 20 completely different sequences of what waving means. And so to some extent, the debates of the oral tradition were exactly this, right? You had a law in the Torah and you had a question that arose of how do you actually do this? And so you have debates, and then the next generation would know, okay, I studied all of these debates. I heard that when Mitch waved his lulav and etrog, he waved it maybe like this. Ruth, when she waved her lulav and etrog, she went up and down. And Daniel, did this weird way of combining the two. And that would be how the oral tradition was passed down generation after generation. Now, what happened in between this, and this we've talked about before, but just seeing it in the sort of historic bullet points might help us understand it a little bit differently. Right in the middle of this process, the temple was destroyed. And the temple being destroyed was not a momentary event. There was actually a 4-year war that Josephus chronicles from 66 to 70 that was called the Roman Jewish War, or one of them. There was actually another big war in the year 137 that was known as the Bar Kokhba revolt. But between this time of 66 to 137, everything in Jerusalem and Israel, there was destruction, there was war, there was bloodshed, and it became increasingly clear, again, to the leaders at the time, okay, you have this oral tradition that's been increasingly developed over the last 100, 200 years. We need to write that down. We can't rely on the fact that, okay, if Mitch, Ruth, and Daniel all have their different ideas of how to wave the lulav, we don't know if Mitch, Ruth, and Daniel are all going to be in the same city and all of the students in the Jewish world are going to be able to come to the academy to learn from that. Because what if Ruth ends up in Alexandria in Egypt, Mitch ends up all the way in Babylonia, and Daniel moves to a farm in the Galilee, right? No student's going to be able to make that travel and learn all the different opinions. So leaders came together and said, let's write that down. Now, the writing down of the oral tradition was extremely controversial. And we'll get into why it was controversial in a second, because I think that actually uncovers some of the secrets and depths of the Talmud. But just 2 more bullet points, and then Ethan, I'll take your question, and then we'll get into the controversy. So that time, the time from, I'm going to say the year 0 to 200, right? So while these wars and destruction was happening, and while the oral tradition was being grown and becoming increasingly robust, but it was still an oral tradition, that is the period of the people known as the Tanaim. And the Tanaim were the people who wrote or came up with the law that was the backbone of the Mishnah. But this is before anything had been written down. Again, this was still Mitch, Ruth, and Daniel coming to the academy, having their different opinions, and then they would have hundreds of students whose sole job was to sit there, memorize the debates, and then go around to the rest of the country and say, I had just spent, the weekend in Yavne, which was the rabbinic center, and here are the different debates. And the students would excitedly discuss those, and it would produce more oral Torah because, again, it's almost like a game of telephone mixed with a little bit of interpretation to it. All of a sudden, we get to Rabbi Judah the Prince, or Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who ends up being the most important rabbinic figure in the Tannaitic period, because Rabbi Judah the Prince was the person in Jewish history to metaphorically put his foot down and say, we need to write this down. This is getting too large, too fast. It's becoming too different, right? People are spreading out too much. We need to actually write down all of this, compile it into a book. And the book can keep the diversity of opinion. So it's not that Rabbi Judah said, I'm going to say that only Ruth is correct and Mitch and Daniel are completely wrong. I'll preserve all 3 of the opinions, but it actually needs to be written down. And so what we're going to start off today is that process of writing the Mishnah. Again, we are in the year, just so we have years here, 200 CE, and Rabbi Judah is about to think about writing down and compiling the Mishnah into, again, written material of which it hadn't been for hundreds of years. Before we get that, Ethan, did you have a question?
No. My question didn't make sense, I realized, so it's all good.
Perfect. I'm sure it did make sense, and if you have another question, feel free to let me know. Okay, so let's do one text here that I actually think is very paradigmatic of this wider discussion. So we are, again, in the Talmud, right? It's a little bit of, right? It's always interesting studying about the Talmud from within the Talmud, but a lot of times we can sort of pull out the history of what the Talmud is. So the Talmud tells us that those who write halachot, and halachot, the literal translation is Jewish law, but what they really mean by halachot is this oral tradition. So those who write down the oral tradition are considered like those who burn the Torah. And ones who learn from written halachot do not receive the reward of studying Torah. So the rabbis tell us, the irony, of course, right, there's always irony to this, is that anybody who's ever seen this throughout history has been reading it, and that means someone had to write it down. But the rabbis are telling us that this oral tradition is supposed to remain oral, and that writing it down is tantamount to destruction of the Torah. And we can discuss why a little bit later, right, the rabbis try to base this in an interpretation of the Torah, where they say Rabbi Yehuda bar Nachmani, the disseminator for Reish Lakish, right? So a disseminator is exactly the type of person I said before, right? Reish Lakish was one of the rabbis. He was a 3rd century rabbi, and a disseminator would be one of the people who was responsible for listening to his opinions and then running around and sharing. Reish Lakish says this. He expounded as follows. One verse in the Torah says, write you these words. And another verse in the Torah says, for by the mouth of these words. And these verses are both in Exodus. These phrases serve to say to you, words that were taught orally, you may not recite in writing, and words that are written, you may not recite orally, i.e. by heart. So we have a tradition, right? What Rabbi Yehuda bar Nachmani is saying is that if something is written Torah, it cannot be recited orally. And we actually follow this law, by the way, right? If anybody's ever been to a Shabbat morning service, right? Nobody in the Jewish world, no matter how well they know the Torah reading, is doing it by heart. You have to read it from within the text. On the flip side, they're saying any law that was an oral tradition, you are not allowed to write that down. But what happens? And they did so, right? So the Talmud's saying, well, you reader might be thinking, so what the heck are you doing reading this oral tradition that somebody obviously wrote? Because they taught as follows. Since one cannot remember the oral law without writing it down, it is permitted to violate the law, as derived from the verse in Psalms. It is time to work for the Lord. They have made void your Torah. They said, it is better to uproot a single law of the Torah and thereby ensure that the Torah is not forgotten from the Jewish people entirely. And so what the rabbis are saying, right, just to summarize, is there is a law that you are not allowed to write down the written law. Sorry, the oral law. But they're interpreting this vague verse in Psalms as basically saying, it is time to work for the Lord, right? In the actual context of this in the Psalms, basically, right? If I was going to give this as an assignment of, reading comprehension, everybody here would probably say this verse means, because people have made your Torah void, it's time to act on behalf of God, right? That is the obvious interpretation to this verse. The rabbis invert this. The rabbis say, the work on behalf of God is making void your Torah, right? It's an incredible flip of the words. And so what the rabbis are essentially saying here is there are times when the future of Judaism depends on being explicitly contrary to the ideas of the Torah, right? It's quite a radical statement. And this, of course, this piece of Talmud does not come without its many, many commentators trying to very quickly narrow the application of this principle, because this doesn't mean, well, Jews really want to, worship idols, or everybody really wants to, eat pork. So therefore, okay, it's time to change the laws of the Torah. But the rabbis do maintain this principle, which is a very interesting legal principle. I'm not sure, Mitch can probably tell us if there are good parallels to American law, but that's sometimes to save the entire system, you have to explicitly say you are subverting one of these rules that's holding back a whole series of other rules here. Mitch, I didn't know if you had something to add in there. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Well, again, probably the one way you can look at it is international law. When we had the Nuremberg trials, those were a way by which we stated that there's a greater law than the written laws, to the law of morality. So we have found ways through history to sort of implement this same idea.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I feel like it's always I oftentimes, and this I do this a lot in my UCI class, where I'll make a lot of analogies to the American legal system, which I have some understanding of, but obviously no expertise. And then I always wonder if somebody who knows a lot more than me about the American legal system is sitting there being like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So it's always good to check in. So just to take a step back, so we have this predicament of Judaism, right? And this, again, we can view as another major inflection point in Judaism, the writing down of this oral tradition, because there really is something that's lost when an oral tradition is written down. And this is something that the rabbis were worried about. And this is something that comes out through the wider discussion of this, which is when you have a tradition that is oral, you're maintaining a lot of different things that once you write it down are immediately lost. One, and I'll go, in no order of importance, but an oral tradition is a lot more flexible than a written down tradition. Because once something is written down, right, you can obviously debate about how to interpret something, but at the end of the day, the more you write about something, the less wiggle room of debate there's going to be. And so if you have a verse in the Torah, and that verse is extremely vague, right? I have my shofar here, so just I feel like I always should do a show and tell, right? If the Torah says on the first day of Tishrei, you should blow a shofar, right? You should have Yom Teruah, right? As the Torah says, right? Okay, everybody generally has an idea that there's a day called Rosh Hashanah and something like this is going to be very important. But what that looks like, again, there's hundreds of thousands of ways you could imagine a Yom Teruah. Does that mean that instead of, let's say, the normal trumpets and drums and harmonicas that they would have in the temple or in synagogues, everybody has to show up with a shofar and this is just the way you make music? Does that mean instead of prayer, you have the shofar? Does it mean the overly ritualized as we do today, where there's a specific time in the prayer service on Rosh Hashanah where you hear the blasts? What kind of blasts should they be, right? The Torah never says you should do Truah, Tekiah, Shvarim, right? All of those things. Once you have a Mishnah and the subsequent commentary on the Mishnah, the Gemara, and the rabbis spell out, as they do in the Mishnah, exactly what the shofar has to look like, exactly what it has to sound like, exactly how many blasts to do, you are losing something there, right? You are taking a tradition and you're making it more and more rigid and less malleable. Now, that might be a good thing to some extent, but you also certainly do lose something there in terms of the creativity of what it means to have an oral tradition. The other part, and this is something that I actually, it's funny because I was writing down some notes a couple hours ago, and I had never thought about this until I actually wrote this down on my notebook here. But this is actually, I think, a problem that we're having more and more in society today, which is an oral tradition requires an established relationship between different generations. If everything has to be passed down orally, you have to have a relationship with parents, with teachers, with rabbis, with the past generation, because they are the wise holders of knowledge, right? If I want to know how to do something in Judaism, and I was living, let's say, in the 1st century BCE, the only thing I could do is sign up for a school or a synagogue or something like that, or find a teacher that would take me as an apprentice. And that person spend years, right? Again, this is something that doesn't happen instantaneously, because if it's not written down, you need to develop a relationship with generation to generation. All of a sudden, when you write it down, once the Mishnah is written, and I see somebody asked a question of what is the Talmud, so we're getting to that here in this explanation. Once Rabbi Judah Hanassi writes down the Mishnah, and Mishnah, by the way, it has a dual meaning, right? Mishnah means either the teaching, or Mishnah also comes from the root sheni, right? The second, as in the second Torah, right? You have your oral Torah, and then you have your second Torah, which is the oral Torah, right? So once the Mishnah is written down and it's neatly organized according to principles, and I'll just take 1 second just to actually show everybody the Mishnah here, right? So this is Sefaria, right? So the online Jewish library. So the Mishnah is made up of 6 orders, so 6 wider topics. And the Mishnah really covers almost every facet of not just Jewish life, but of legal life one could want. So we have many books about agriculture, and these are all of the different laws of agriculture, from how much charity do you have to give from your crops, all the way from what do you do in the Shemitah year, right? The sabbatical year every 7 years, all the way to if you're making challah, you have to separate some and actually donate it to the temple, right? Anything you want about agriculture, right? We then have all of the different holidays, right? So as opposed to, if I want to know, let's say the next holiday coming up is Purim, right? The next major holiday. So I want to know the laws of reading the book of Esther. I can just go to the Mishnah, right? I don't need a rabbi. I don't need a teacher. I'll just go and open up my Mishnah and learn that, right? The next order of the Mishnah is family law. So everything that deals with marriage and divorce and children and inheritance and all of those issues. Then we get damages. And this actually reads like I've never taken first year of law school, but I always imagine this is what it's like to take a class on torts, because you actually get cases of, right, just to click on one, right? This is a famous one that a lot of school children start with. So you get this sort of paradigmatic Talmudic case. Two people run into a court holding a garment. The first one says, I found it. The second one says, I found it. This one says, it's all mine. The second one says, it's all mine. What does the court do? The court says, well, they each have to take an oath that they own at least half of it, and then you split it. And then the Mishnah gets into other cases. Well, what happens if me and somebody else are running in and I say, it's all mine, and then the other person says, no, we bought it together, it's 50-50. And so you can imagine all the other cases that come up here. But again, we've moved very far away from what people commonly think of as religious law, right? This is not just, I want to celebrate Shabbat, what do I have to do? What are the prayers, right? Just to go through one more in the Mishnah, right? They have a whole section on sacrifices, which already is a little bit interesting because this was all written down in a post-sacrificial era. And so there's actually a lot to rabbinic law, and I'll say a little bit more about this in a few minutes. There's a lot to rabbinic law that is explicitly not focused on the practical. And what I mean by that is the rabbis are trying to build up a legal framework for what they imagine to be an ideal legal system, even though they know it's not happening in practice. And there's actually two interesting ways to think about this. One interesting way is this exact example, which is they have an entire order and several tractates about sacrifices and also several on purity laws, both of which became irrelevant after the temple, or the majority of purity laws. Today, we still obviously have mikvaot, and there's other types of purity laws that are kept, but it's about 5 to 10% of what used to be in the temple. The other way of thinking about this, and this is a fascinating irony of rabbinic law in general, there was no domain or area that the rabbis were actually in charge of. And what I mean by that is a lot of law, if we think about it from some perspective, law is developed by a ruling body, oftentimes a government, in order to govern the citizens that are within it. At no point of the rabbinic era did the rabbis actually have any type of political or governmental power over any of the people that they were writing this law for. And so the vast majority of time in rabbinic history, the rabbis were writing these laws of damages, right? So let's say I'm pulling into synagogue and I accidentally bump into Mark's car, right? So we need to figure out, right, how much do I owe Mark, right? How do we know if it's my fault? What if he was backing up at the same time? And so wherever Jews were living at the time, whether under Roman rule in Israel or under Zoroastrian rule in Babylonia, they would have probably gone to the wider Roman or Zoroastrian court. This is something that a lot of academics talk about. The rabbis also, though, discuss all the ramifications of this law. And so there's a lot of inquiry as to why the rabbis spent so much time talking about parts of law that they were never actually responsible for. And what this builds up to, and we'll probably discuss this in about 5 or 6 weeks when we discuss sort of the legacy of Talmud study, because Talmud study in Judaism grew from a practical way to ensure the continuity of tradition to an entire worldview. And today, just as an aside, right, in yeshivot, there are mostly ultra-Orthodox, but also the rest of the Jewish world, there are yeshivot, places of Jewish study, where people for decades at a time spend 15 hours a day just studying Talmudic law, even though there is no place in the world, even any city in Israel, that operates according to Talmudic law. So something is up here, right? And so we'll try to unpack that in a couple of weeks. So all this is to say, going back to our sheet before, once all this is written down, you lose an enormous amount, because all of a sudden now, if I am some smart alecky kid and I want to become the next expert on Jewish law, and I want to be the next big shot head of the court or a rabbi or whatever, I no longer have to find myself as much somebody from the past generation, right? I can just get a hold of the Mishnah and get a hold of other rabbinic works, and I can come up with most of the answers myself. And so this was seen as a serious loss in the writing down of the oral tradition. the reason why I said that this was an interesting comparison to now is because we're actually going through a very similar phenomenon, I think, with not just the internet, but with social media, where basically everything is available. And it's actually not an uncommon thing for me to hear when talking about, let's say, history or civics or anything like that. Well, why do I actually need to know this? I'll just Google it if it ever comes up, which again is a very common thing. And one can understand why somebody would have that view if you grew up with all of the information in the world basically at your fingertips in your phone, right? What is the point of memorizing random dates of 1776 and the Civil War and all of these things? But I think we all know when it comes to knowledge and when it comes to understanding history, or culture, or politics, religion, whatever we call it, the whole is certainly greater than the sum of its parts of a bunch of facts, right? Like there is something that we call learnedness or wisdom or something that isn't once you get to memorizing 100 facts, then you're wise, right? There's some interconnectivity between all of that you actually need to move on. And so the rabbis, in warning against the writing down of the oral Torah, were bemoaning, I think, this exact process that ironically we're dealing with today. But obviously they had to, right? And what they point out was, well, at the end of the day, they had no choice. And so the rabbis end up writing the Mishnah, and Rabbi Judah the Prince is the person to basically put the rubber stamp, and he was the one to finally, right? He was, right? He wasn't an actual prince, but it was an honorific title. And so you could imagine a project like this can only be undertaken by a community leader, because if some other person decided to do it, right, everybody would reject it. But Rabbi Judah wrote down the Mishnah, and all of a sudden now copies of these texts of all of these rabbinic debates about everything from how they used to give sacrifices in the temple, all the way to how do we celebrate Passover, all the way to what happens if I bump into Mark's car in the temple parking lot. All of these laws were then sent out to the Jewish world, which at that point, again, this was right after the temple was destroyed and right after the Bar Kokhba revolt. And so at this point, the Jewish world was spread out. And now we get to this map, right? The two major centers of the Jewish world at this time were one still in Israel, albeit if we scroll into this map a little bit more, you can see that it's not in Jerusalem, right? So the center of the Jewish world ceased to be in Jerusalem because Jerusalem was destroyed. And after the Bar Kokhba revolt, Jews were actually not allowed to live in Jerusalem in the 2nd century CE because the Romans put a ban on Jews living there. So Jewish life in Israel moved to the north, to the Galilee. And Jewish life also, again, moved east to Babylonia, right? Modern day Iraq and a little bit of Iran. And so the Mishnah was sent out to Jews all over these communities. And then we can all guess what happens next, right? Schools are opened up. And these schools, instead of being centers of memorizing this oral tradition, they became centers of studying the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah is a very complex set of cases. And one can imagine very quickly, if we're sitting here, and let's say we are one such academy of Mishnaic study, and we start with the first Mishnah, let's say the example that we gave, and somebody says, Ethan and Maddie ran into a court, each holding a cloth, and they said, this is half mine, this is half mine. If we are 20 people all studying that text together, we probably all have a lot of questions. Maybe some of us don't actually think that makes sense. Maybe some of us would say, well, who cares if they take an oath? Why don't you actually try to bring in evidence? What if there are witnesses? What about if one of them has greater familiarity with the cloth, right? So you can imagine very quickly that the Mishnah ends up, ironically, having similar problems that the Torah has, right? And this is one of the secrets of Talmudic study, is that it's recursive. And so what I mean by recursive is that the Mishnah was made to be an explanatory guide of the interpretation and application of the Torah. That was written down, that was spread out to the Jewish world. And then for hundreds of years, that was the guidebook, right? Every Jew and every Jewish community would have the Tanakh, right? The Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, and the Mishnah. And that's how they would figure out what to do. But the only problem with that is that even if you try to write down a book that comes up with all possible situations of what can arise in a legal dispute, you're never going to get it right. And so over the course of the next many hundred years, from 200 to 500, these two centers, right, both Israel and Babylonia, the Jewish communities there were actively engaged with the Mishnah and debating about how to interpret it and how to understand it and how to, right, what happens if they don't actually like the conclusion of the Mishnah? How do you reinterpret, right? So the same thing that the rabbis of the Mishnah did to the Torah, you start to have people doing to the Mishnah. And those people become known as the Amoraim. And the Amoraim were the people who ended up writing, or their debates ended up becoming what we know as the Gemara. And just to answer the question from earlier, when people say Talmud, the Talmud is the Mishnah and Gemara together as a single set. Because now, if we were to study Talmud, so let's go back to Sefaria for a second. And so let's say Talmud, and let's say we are interested in Passover because it is coming up. And so we go to a chapter in the Tractate of Passover. And so we see first a Mishnah, right? So that's this first generation text. So we'll just do this. I actually didn't pre-plan this one, so we'll see how much I remember, right? So this Mishnah is telling us on the eve of Passover, close to Mincha time, a person is not allowed to eat until dark so that they are able, to eat matzah with a hearty appetite. So what is the Mishnah saying? So, right, everybody knows, right, one of the central rituals of a Passover Seder is to eat matzah. And so the rabbis didn't want you to get to your Passover Seder having just had a huge feast and you say, oh, shoot, I have to, scarf down this matzah, right? You should do this, right? Every Passover, right? You should not eat after about noon so you're hungry enough to eat the matzah. When this gets into the Gemara, right, and now we can see what the Gemara does to the Mishnah. So the Gemara's first line, the Gemara expresses surprise at the Mishnah statement that one may not eat on Passover Eve from the time that is adjacent to the Mishnah. So what the Gemara says is, why is this halacha particularly with Passover Eve? Even on the eves of Shabbat and other festivals, you are not supposed to eat in the late afternoon, as we learned in a Braita. A Braita is a text from the time of the Mishnah. A person should not eat on the eve of Shabbat and festivals from Mincha time onwards, so that he enters Shabbat with a desire to eat and enjoy the Shabbat meal. And so the Gemara already takes the Mishnah and subjects it to the same type of analysis that one would subject the Torah to, which is to say, there are parts of this that might not make sense. There are contradictions. What do we do? And then, right, without getting, too far down this rabbit hole, the Gemara is then going to try to offer a solution. Well, it maybe says, right, on Passover, here specifically, the answer that it's going to give is, on Passover, everybody knows that there is a mitzvah, an obligation to eat matzah. So maybe you're actually going to be less careful because you're thinking when you're eating your meal, well, I still need to eat matzah. So maybe you won't eat too much. And so we need to specifically say, no, you can't eat anything because we want you to be really hungry. As opposed to Shabbat, where there's no mitzvah to eat, people will generally be more careful because they're not trying to withhold their hunger for anything, right? And so the Gemara ends up, right, and you can imagine this quickly turning into a multi-page, 5-6 page debate about how exactly to apply this. So back to our history for 1 second. This then becomes the primary mode of Jewish learning, discourse, and community for the next 300 years. And so the period from 200 to 500, and I'll just write this in also, here, 200 to 500, becomes centered around the Gemara, which is even more argumentative and preserves even more of a multiplicity of opinions than the Mishnah does. And so this combination of texts, the Talmud, has been for the last 1,500 years, and we'll talk a little bit more about how it became this way, the central text of Judaism. Because the first thing that any Jewish thinker after that did when they had any question that arose, from legal to philosophical to cultural to anything like that, is consult, well, I'm sure the Talmud had a debate about this. So let me just go and dig that up, and then we'll see what happens after. I want to do 2 more bullet points, and then we'll take a step back and sort of regroup for a minute, just to go through our history completely. At a certain point, the Gemara also became a closed text. And one could imagine this came at considerable debate, because when you're studying Gemara, it does not read like a bunch of people sat there and said, let's neatly organize a bunch of Jewish laws and even maintain the diversity of opinion. The Gemara quite literally reads like, and for anybody who studied Talmud, they'll sort of intuitively know what I'm talking about. A group of 5 friends were sitting at a table for hours, chatting and debating about whatever the hot button topics were at the time, and all bringing in supports from politics or law or history to support their viewpoint. And so the Gemara is a very tough, right? The Talmud is one of the most complex religious texts to study, but at a certain point that had to be sealed. And so the classic framers of who sealed it were 2 men known as Ravina and Ravashi. And these were Babylonian scholars in the early 6th century. And they were the ones, according to the popular historical account, that ended up saying, okay, we have the Mishnah, which already was a sealed document for hundreds of years, but now we have all of these different collections of debates about the Mishnah, known as the Gemara. Let's take all of these, let's neatly order it so we can put, okay, obviously the discussions about Passover go under Passover. What happens if a discussion is both about Passover and Shabbat? Okay, maybe we'll put that under Shabbat. Maybe we'll actually include that twice, as often happens in the Mishnah, right? And they were the ones who actually put that together. Now, there's one more layer of redaction, and then we'll take a moment for questions. It's funny because right before this, when I was preparing this class about an hour ago, I was doing some last minute studying, and I opened for the first time in probably 6 years. When I was studying for my master's, I did my master's in rabbinic literature. So one of the tests that I had to take for my master's was basically, I had to read like 15 different academic theories as to the compilation of the Talmud, which of course all 15 scholars completely disagreed as to how this process worked. And so I wrote myself a nice little study guide of the book and then a small summary of each chapter. So I real quickly skimmed that before this. There's a lot of debate as to how exactly this process ended up happening, right? How exactly the Gemara and Talmud that we have now, right? At what point was that actually settled? The majority of the academic view, just to throw it out there, and this was pioneered by a great scholar and rabbi, David Levine, who actually recently passed away, I think about a year ago. And he came up with what he calls it's called sometimes the Sivoraim or the Stamim, right? Sivoraim means, Svara is the Hebrew word meaning logic or ration. So either these were the logical people, and Stamim comes from the Hebrew word of stam, it's almost nameless. And so this layer, what he came up with is that there's a lot in the Gemara that almost does seem like it was neatly edited. And so it would never have been enough for 2 people to just compile all the works and then publish that. Some later group of people had to come together with explicit intent to say, we're going to organize this according to some foundational principles, maybe even change around the order, and maybe even sometimes give some conclusions or inklings as to who we think is correct in different debates. And that layer is what's known as the Sivaraim or Stamim layer. And these people existed from about 500 to 700 CE. And so we have sort of a full picture snapshot for a second. And again, we'll go back to doing some actual sources in the Talmud. We'll do one more for today. And then next week, we'll actually dive into a little bit about some of the mechanics of the Talmud. But just a big picture here, we have all the way from late Second Temple Pharisees in about, let's say, the year 100 BCE, all the way to 700 CE. So about 800 years that encompasses this time period. And so whenever people say the rabbis or the Talmud or any of these sort of vague terms that are oftentimes thrown out, this is exactly what they're talking about. This 800-year time period that, again, is very hard to drill down exactly when was written when and how the mechanics of this were written. But it's one of those things where by the end of this process, right, however exactly those mechanics worked, because those are going to be endlessly debated, we have a work called the Talmud that, again, became the central book of Judaism both 1,500 years ago and still is the central book of Judaism for basically Jews of all shapes and sizes. Okay, so taking a step back, I see that there are a couple questions in the chat. Does anybody have any questions while I'm sort of reading through all of these comments? Mitch, go for it.
I think what you're saying is really fascinating, because if we try to imagine us who've grown up in the United States, subject to United States law, our total history of law is literally what we extracted from the creation of the Constitution in the 1790s. So we got what, maybe 230 years, 250 years of a country. This is 800 years. So if we think of this law developing over 800 years, and we see how we developed from the Declaration of Independence, the preamble to the Constitution, the amendments, and then all the case law that came out doing what the Mishnah and Gemara have done, we're still working on it, and we still don't know where we're going. We have a lot of issues we still debate, whether it be civil, criminal, constitutional elements, and how to live within society. And it looks like these were all issues debated, maybe more to minutia than our American system exists. But these were all debated laws for hundreds and hundreds of years and generations of people. And what I'm concerned with is, if the Mishnah is going over hundreds of years, it means it's generations and generations. As time evolves, and yes, we've sped up time in modernity. As time evolves, it means that it's going to progress in a different way even before it gets finalized.
Mhm.
So what is the law? I mean, I'm thinking of, let's use you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk, against maybe something in your boring Kedoshim. You should not put a stumbling block before the blind. I mean, these laws have evolved even up till now, to some extent.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, all those points are spot on. The irony with the Talmud, and this we'll see in a little bit, and Ethan, I'll take your question in a second, is that once the Talmud was sealed, of course, the Talmud sometimes gives final answers, but oftentimes just leaves debates as sort of a neat three-way debate, even after, different opinions were attacked and, narrowed and things like that. And so it's not like the Jewish world was left with explicit answers. And so it actually required the hundreds of years after the Talmud, and this we'll focus on in 2 weeks, the time period known as the Geonim. Geonim just means the greats, but this was the time period from about 700 to, let's say, 900, was now the Talmud is a published work. Now every Jewish library, synagogue, study hall in the Jewish world has a full set of Talmud. The Talmud is very intense, right? Unlike the Torah or even the Mishnah, your average person, people that do Daf Yomi, right? If you did one double-sided page of Talmud, you finish every 7.5 years. And this isn't reading, a page like, I don't know, Harry Potter. This is reading a page of, minute debates, and, the text tends to be very small. So double-sided page of Talmud is a lot more than a normal double-sided page. And so the Geonim were basically people who had, a pretty in-depth knowledge of the Talmud, and then they were basically doing Talmud to the Talmud. They were trying to spit out final answers to that. And the reason why I said Jewish tradition has been recursive over the past 2,000 years is they published their ideas, and then the next generation got a hold of that and said, okay, this is interesting, but there are new applications, there are new ideas out here, we need to do that again. And this happens over and over and over again. Arguably, it's happening today. I mean, every time anybody reads a responsa, and when we talk about modernity, we can talk about this a lot more. And this is, again, true whether or not we're talking about Reform responsa or Orthodox responsa, right? Responsa is quite literally a new application has come up, a new case study has come up. We've discovered something new about the world, right? All of a sudden now we have the ability. I was just reading an article a couple of days ago about lab-grown meat, right? Where they're able to basically grow meat from cells. And right, so there's a question, is that considered meat from a Jewish legal perspective? Can I have a cheeseburger, right, under the laws of kosher, right? The Talmud never discussed that, right? 8th century rabbis never discussed that. So this process happens all over again, right? Where now you have people that are debating about how to interpret the Talmud and doing exactly what the Gemara did to the Mishnah and doing exactly what the Mishnah did to the Torah, which is, again, why Torah study is, one, so exciting, two, such a daunting system of laws and world, because it's very hard to just jump, right? There's no good way to start, right? You just have to sort of jump in head first because there's no chapter 1 of Talmud. It's not like, the Talmud famously starts off with a very technical question, right? The first question that the Mishnah deals with is, what time can we start saying Shema every Shabbat? Every night. And all of a sudden the Mishnah straight off the bat gives 3 different opinions. And then the Gemara spends pages debating why those 3 opinions are there. And so I can imagine somebody who's never studied any Talmud before thinking, okay, I want to start studying this monumental work. I'll start at page 1. And they have no idea what Shema is. They have no idea, right, what all these different times are, right? And they're just basically thrown right into it. So yes, 100%, Mitch. Ethan, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm curious. So I work with young adults a lot, and a lot of my other like Jewish educators I know in similar positions are young adults. And I'm noticing a lot of these people are tending to have the view, are definitely sliding towards what feels like an anti-rabbinic Judaism era, and not using Talmud as a legal sense, but like as more as a historical document, and just saying how a lot of them would say that, like, look, the Talmud disenfranchises a lot of different things, and how can we talk about social justice when using a text like the Talmud when things evolve over so many years, and that it was written by male rabbis who were literate. And so I'm curious if this is a new line of thinking, it's like a growing trend, or if there's always kind of been this voice in the background.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I would say there's almost two different Talmuds, or even 2 different ways to view the Talmud. And I think Jewish tradition throughout history has viewed it in both ways at the same time. One is what we can call uppercase T Talmud, like the book that somebody calls the Talmud, that's published with its own discussion and own conclusions. That already from the time of Avraham Geiger, who many might recognize as the founder of Reform Judaism, right? He was a German rabbi. He grew up in a traditional yeshiva system, so he actually had a very deep knowledge of the Talmud, but he famously started writing, basically, one of his famous principles was the rabbis of the Talmud were interesting, but they have no more authority than any modern Jew. And so that became one of the underpinnings of his new movement. The second way to view the Talmud is almost a lowercase t Talmud, is sort of a Jewish methodology of engaging with texts. And that, I think, is much more timeless, because all Judaism is an interpretive tradition. And so even a rejection of the explicit laws of the Talmud, you still need to engage with text in an interpretive manner in order to keep going. And so Judaism has never really had the type of, let's say, Protestant Reformation, right? This sort of, let's go back to just scripture. I think I mentioned a couple weeks ago, there have been movements over Jewish history, and most notably the Karaites, that have tried to do that. But it quickly becomes paradoxical, and not to insult the Karaite community, because I'm not saying it derogatorily. It's just, it is impossible to take a legal text and apply it to contemporary cases without engaging in interpretation, right? It's almost similar to, the same thing applies, I think, to the Constitution, of people who say, well, let's just figure out exactly what the original intention was and apply those literally. It's an interesting philosophic experiment, but I just don't think it works on a practical level. And so I think, again, Judaism has, right? So today, there's obviously a big difference between how different communities engage with the Talmud, right? If you go to an Orthodox rabbi and you ask a question of, can I use, Zoom to blow my shofar out to the community on Rosh Hashanah, what they're going to do is they're going to open the Talmud. They're going to try to figure out, okay, electricity, is that okay on Rosh Hashanah? Maybe yes, maybe no. Let's figure it out. Maybe electricity is similar to building a circuit. Maybe it's similar to writing a fire. Let's analyze the discussions of building and fire in the Talmud and then the Talmudic commentators. And then let's figure out if I'm allowed to hear a recording or an echo of the shofar and not the shofar blast itself. Okay, there's actually an interesting discussion in the Talmud of what happens if somebody takes a shofar, blows it into a cistern, right, a water pit, and somebody else is on the other side and hears the echo. So maybe we'll use that as a starting point, right? So they're going to view the Talmud much more in a legal way. Still, in non-Orthodox communities, when engaging in discussion of, okay, we have this timeless and age-old ritual of hearing the shofar, and we have new occasions, right, such as COVID and social distancing that arise. How do we take these two and make it work? That's also a form of Talmud to some extent. And so there's sort of big T Talmud and little case T Talmud. Like in my opinion, and I think I'm certainly biased here because both my yeshiva training and my academic training centered around the rabbinic time period. But I'm actually disappointed that the liberal Jewish community isn't more involved in Talmud study, only because the methodology of the Talmud is actually, I think actually is a much bigger underpinning for liberalization than it is for being more conservative, because the Talmud, again, as we've been discussing, and actually the one case I did want to do today in the Talmud illustrates this point nicely. So Ethan, I'm glad you asked that. The Talmud was a attempted reformation of Judaism. I mean, that's certainly what it was. I mean, nobody calls the Talmud the Jewish Reformation, but if we're analyzing this from an objective perspective, and somebody has the definition of Reformation, and somebody then hears what the rabbis in the Talmud did to Judaism, I mean, it's certainly a reformation. And so, right, the one point, actually, let's go a little bit to a text to illustrate it, so I'm not just giving vague examples, and then we can come back to your question. So the rabbis, again, the rabbis are operating now thousands of years after biblical law. And so just like a lot of things, culture, right, ideas, societal norms evolve, right, the rabbis were also privy to these same sociological considerations. And so just as today, we can name countless things that we don't do today that 500 years ago were considered completely normal and reasonable, the rabbis had the exact same thing when their relationship with the Torah. And so one such interesting case is this famous case in Hebrew, it's called the Ben Sora Umora. In English, it's a wayward son, where we learn towards the end of the Torah in Deuteronomy, if a man has a wayward and defiant son who does not listen to his father or mother and does not obey them even after they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his town at the public place of his community. They shall say to the elders of this town, this son of ours is disloyal and defiant. He does not heed us. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Thereupon the men of his town shall stone him to death. Thus you will sweep out the evil from your midst. All of Israel will hear and be afraid. Right? So this is verbatim in the Torah, in the book of Deuteronomy. So you get a text like this, and just seeing people's faces here, everybody cringed a little bit, right? And it's obvious why, right? Because the idea of taking a young child who is not listening to their parents and stoning them is, of course, abhorrent. And saying that we find this abhorrent is not this is not somebody in the 21st century looking back on an ancient text and being uncomfortable with this. I mean, it's partially that, but the rabbis were equally uncomfortable. So listen to how the rabbis engage with this. So we first get to the Mishnah. And so again, the rabbis have this constant dialectic, tradition and innovation. So the rabbis were not going to say, this law makes no sense, let's scratch it out from our Torah. But what do the rabbis do, right? They reinterpret. So let's see how the rabbis reinterpret. So they say, if his father desires to have him punished, but not his mother, or the reverse, he is not treated as a stubborn and rebellious son unless they both desire it. Rabbi Judah said, if his mother is not fit for his father, he does not become a stubborn and rebellious son. So already in the Mishnah, the rabbis are adding more and more stipulations. And what's actually interesting here, and there's actually a lot of, if we had another hour to discuss just this case, we can get into what's interesting about the rabbinic engagement, at least in the Mishnah, is the rabbis flip the script a little bit. The rabbis immediately read this case and think, what's wrong with the parents, right? They're saying, well, is this a case where their parents are bickering? Are their parents maybe not fit for each other, right? There's no young child that just goes off and does this with no parental focus. But once this gets into the Gemara, the rabbis really point this home. So the rabbis in the Gemara ask, right, because again, they're interpreting and debating the Mishnah. What does the Mishnah mean by not fit, right? When it says if the mother is not fit for the father, he means not physically like his father. Okay, let's continue. It was taught likewise. Rabbi Judah said, if his mother is not like his father in voice, appearance and stature, he does not become a rebellious son. Why so? Because the Torah says he will not obey our voice. And since they must be alike in voice, they must also be in appearance.
Yeah,
And
it's almost that time.
so the rabbis in the Gemara take this case and they say, okay, not only are these added stipulations, now we're going to actually add stipulations that have no chance of being true, right? There are no two parents that are identical twins, father and mother, that have the same voice, appearance, and stature. So the rabbis in the Gemara conclude, there has never been a stubborn and rebellious son, and never will be. Why then was the law written? That you can study it and receive reward. And so the rabbinic engagement with this text is incredible, because they're not rejecting the law. I mean, we might read this as a rejection, but they're keeping the law. They're saying it's still worthwhile to actually read this in synagogue once a year and discuss it, because there's some reward that can come out from this discussion. What's the reward? The rabbis actually have a whole debate about that, right? Maybe this is an interesting case study in bad parenting. Maybe, as one rabbi suggests, this is an interesting thought experiment of you are punishing this child because he's going to grow up to do worse things, right? There's a whole bunch of, interesting legal and philosophic rabbit holes we can go down, which the rabbis do, as to why the rabbis then think this was included in the Torah. Simultaneously, not throwing out tradition, right? They're actually, in some way, they're heavily quoting from tradition, right? They're quoting from the verse when they say not fit. They're quoting from the verse when they say our voice, right? So they're actually basing their interpretation off of a very close reading of the text, but then they're completely changing the conclusion. And so this is paradigmatic, again, of a lot of the Talmud, of them saying, right, not just, okay, a lot of these rituals are untenable, now their temple is destroyed. A lot of the ethics of this tradition, right, again, if you want to keep a tradition going for 4,000 years, you have to admit that morals and societal norms are going to change and you have to catch up. And so all this is to say, I mean, Ethan, it's funny that you asked that question, because it goes right into this text, and how I anyway wanted to conclude. To view the Talmud as just a bunch of conversations of ancient, yes, all male rabbis who were, arguing, and that has no relevance in our Jewish practice. In some very narrow sense, from some perspective, that could be true, but I think that misses the wider methodology, because this is exactly how Jews approach our entire tradition, right? We say Torah and tradition is extremely valuable, and modernity and contemporary ideas and culture is very valuable. And so, we have to merge that in some way. And this is not unique to the Talmud, right? We can view the same story through medieval Judaism, when you have characters like Maimonides who try to do this with more of a Greek philosophical view of the world. And you have this again in Jewish congregations all over the world, when different cases arise, right? One very important and very explicit example of this is if you read some of the early responses from the Reform and then the conservative movement about gay marriage. One of the interesting things that comes out there, one, it's just worth noting that both the Reform and conservative movement backed officially gay marriage way before it was federally legal. And so if you actually go through and read the responses that were put out by those movements, the responses are intensely drawing from tradition. I mean, this is like a wealth of Jewish knowledge about treating people with dignity and about ideas and relationship and what does love mean and all of these things. Now, from one perspective, LGBT issues from a literal reading of the Torah is almost impossible to defend, right? The Torah doesn't get into long discussions. There's 2 verses in the entirety of the Torah about homosexuality, right? Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20. Does not treat it too well, right? Everybody knows the verse. It doesn't need to be repeated. The rabbis in the Talmud don't treat it well, right? It wasn't considered a societal norm there. But you get into modern responses, and the Jewish community did exactly this to that idea, right? They said, okay, we now have access to more knowledge of what is ethical, what is right, how to run a society. We also have this tradition. A cursory read of this tradition is not tenable with what we now know to be ethical. Therefore, let's do Talmud to the Talmud, right? Let's take our tradition, let's subject it to more analysis, more interpretation, and let's again, be able to move the needle there. And I actually think this is a much more powerful of a mechanism, I'll talk just Judaism here, than it is if somebody were to get up and say, okay, well, the Torah and Talmud are now irrelevant, right? Let's come up with a new tradition, because it's a lot harder to do that outside of the framework and structure of a set tradition. Not to mention it just won't catch on, and then you'll have even more dispersion. And so to some extent, again, one of the reasons why I think the rabbinic era is so important, and it's the reason why if we all enrolled tomorrow in an ultra-Orthodox yeshiva, we would be studying Talmud for 15 hours. And it's the reason why I would argue basically anybody who wants to be at the forefront of Jewish ideas today should study Talmud, is not because of the explicit conclusion, but this type of engagement with text and methodology is paradigmatic, I think, of the way that the rest of Jewish interpretation and also future Jewish interpretation works, which is, again, this deep engagement with tradition and modernity and those tensions, and trying to figure out what does it mean that we want our children and grandchildren, our students, and all of that to be carriers of this tradition, and also to be able to mold it into what will inevitably in 100 years from now exist in the world that none of us can predict right now. And how do we still infuse that with Jewishness? I think I will officially end this class. Happy to stay for questions and comments. There was one more text, but I guess I'll save that for next time, because I see it's already getting close to 7, which means 10 p.m. for our East Coast friends. Any quick questions, comments? Thank you all so much for coming back after a nice long winter break. We will be back for the next, several Mondays in a row. I think there's one in February where I'm going to be gone for a wedding, but I will let everybody know a couple weeks ahead of time. But next Monday, you will all get an email, and I'll also send out for people who might have missed some past classes, some of the videos and recordings of past classes. But otherwise, again, I'm here for questions, but thank you all so much and have a wonderful night and week.